Welcome to Module 5 for English 100. In this module, we are going to go through the formatting, citation, and references expectations, which in our program we use APA for. This is going to be a bit of a longer video because there is a lot of information to get through on this topic. It is worth noting that the only way that you really get good at these things is through practice. So first of all, whenever you are borrowing information or ideas from others, this is where citation and referencing comes into play. In order to avoid being seen as plagiarizing or misusing information, you need to be able to properly cite and reference. Now, different areas of study as well as different organizations might use different citation and referencing styles. We use the American Psychological Association format, which is what APA stands for. This is used by education, but also a lot of the social sciences, psychology, sociology, and a lot of other areas. If you've done some writing before, you might have encountered some other citation and referencing formats. For example, in the field of history, it is often Chicago or Turabian that's used. In economics, it's often Harvard style that's used. If you've ever been in an engineering program or in an information technology program, they use the IEEE system. Some languages and some humanities use MLA, which is probably the second most used after APA. And in the world of law, they often use Oxford style. However, we're going to be using APA. It will be used for all your courses in the ELCC and EA programs, and the expectations is that you will use it in every course. So this style here has a lot of online support. It has its own website where you can find more specific details and examples. And APA is going to be used within your assignments, whether they are essays, discussion forum posts, making slideshows, any sort of recordings, or any other assignments where you need to acknowledge the words or knowledge of others. APA is currently in its 7th edition, so if it's been a while since you've done writing, maybe you've done some writing in college or university before, but it's been a few years ago, you might need to update some of the little pieces for your APA knowledge because some things have changed, which is normal because as we get new kinds of sources, like the internet, we need to be able to consistently acknowledge those types of sources. Now, for many students, APA formatting, citation, and references are a little bit challenging because it's almost like learning another language, and there's all sorts of rules involved with them. And like anything that's a skill, you have to do that practice to become good at it, as well as check the feedback you're getting from instructors when they mark your work. Now, there is a lot of practice things available online, including the textbook itself in its online format. So on the Moodle, I have under each module the PDF versions of the chapters you need to read. But if you go back to the Moodle and go under course information and course, scroll down to the course textbooks, there's actually an online link for the Horkoff textbook, which can be helpful because she has a lot of activities in her online textbook that you can use to practice some of the APA skills. There's also a number of sources available on the Moodle under supports where you can go and practice a lot of APA pieces. Some of these are found under the online writing help section. APA is also something you can ask the Writing Center at the college or the librarians for help on. So when we are doing our writing, most assignments follow the same sort of structure. You will have a title page, and this should only ever be 1 page in length. It will be distinct from everything else. You shouldn't have your writing starting on your title page. Your second page, and then however many pages your writing takes up, are the next part of your paper. And then at the end, on its own page or pages, depending on how many you have, are your references. So this will all require some distinct formatting pieces. So formatting, when I'm talking about this is what your document looks like, how is it organized, and what sort of things can you use and not use in it. In APA formatting, there is rules around the fonts, the page margins, the layout of the pages themselves, as well as a number of other things. So there is a video in addition to this one that goes over how to format in APA using Microsoft Word. If you are not using Microsoft Word for your writing assignments, there will still be videos available that will help you. Make sure you go into YouTube or any other search area and look up your specific program and then add in how to format in APA. And there will be videos to help you. There are literally thousands of videos about this. They are all available to you. They're all free online. It's just a matter of you taking the initiative to find them. So the first thing we need to look at is fonts. APA uses fonts that are called sans serif. So sans means without, and so it's saying without a serif. And a serif are these little fancy strokes that happen at the end of some types of fonts. Sans serif fonts, which means they don't have those fancy little end pieces on the letters, are easier to read for most people. For example, if somebody has dyslexia or something else that affects their visual perception, there are certain fonts that are more accessible and usable for those people. And so APA wants to be read by as many people as possible, so they are going to use those fonts. Now, the type of font you have from the list is your choice, but the recommended fonts include 11-point Calibri, and so 11-point has to deal with the font size. So here I have a screenshot of my own Microsoft Word. Sometimes it might look different than what you see in yours because I have my own settings applied, but your font is usually right up at the top here in your home section, and the size is right beside it. So you can pick from that drop-down menu. There's also 11-point Georgia, 11-point Arial, or 10-point Lucida Sans Unicode. So you want to pick one of those and stick with it. It's also important to note that we don't change font sizes within APA formatted assignments. So you're not going to have any words that are going to be bigger or smaller than any of the rest, and you're not going to change fonts within your document. It's all going to be the same font. There's also rules about what is called font style. So there's not a lot of styling used in APA because it can limit the readability. However, we do use bold. So bold in your Microsoft Word is often found just below your font choice, and you can click it on or off. And so that might be used for headings. And we use italics when we are talking about titles of text and legal documents. And italics is just below your font name as well. There should be no underlining or no colored text because these do not come into APA formatting and they can impact the readability. All the text in your document should also be double spaced. If you are not sure how to double space, there is a couple things that you can do in your document. And I'm going to open a document right now so you can see how that looks. Again, my own copy of Microsoft Word is probably going to look a little bit different from yours based on what sort of settings I have. I am going to try and make this a little bit bigger. Unfortunately, I can't make the stuff at the top bigger, which is where we can edit things. But if I had a bunch of writing, and I'm just going to copy this multiple times just for the purpose of demonstration. So by default, Microsoft Word will be single-spaced, which means you won't have spaces between the writing. Now, it used to be when I was in school, you double-spaced your writing because you were writing by hand. And when you were writing by hand, that meant it made it more difficult for the teacher to make notes. So you double-spaced so that they could write their feedback between those lines. Well, with the internet and digital writing, we actually have found out that double spacing is easier for people to read when they're reading online. So APA has accepted that as the default. So to change this all to be double spaced, I have two options. No matter what, I'm going to highlight it all. And since this is the only thing I have in my document, I'm going to use my hotkey, Control A, and that automatically highlights everything in my document. If not, you can always drag your mouse over it too. Now, the first place I can change to double spacing is there is a little icon up above near all your fonts. That's if you hold your mouse on it, it will say line and paragraph spacing. If you click on that, you can go to the number 2.0. This will double space it. The other way you can do it, so I'll hit Control Z here to undo that, is I can right click once it's highlighted and go to the word paragraph. And from here, I can go down to where it says spacing, and I can make my line spacing double. Both of those will do the same thing. Now, your page formatting. APA requires that you include a page number on all your pages in the top right corner. So the easiest way to do this, and I'll bring in my document here again, I'm going to go up to Insert at the top, and I'm going to click on this page number piece here. From there, it'll give you different options. You want to pick top of page and then plain number 3. So whichever one is on the right, most people have the same setup as I do, so it should be the same. But this one has a plain number in the top right-hand corner. This will open what's called your header. And so once that's done, you can just hit the close header and footer in the thing at the top that pops up when you do this. Now all of your pages in the top right-hand corner will have a number. You don't have to format anything about that number, you just have to make sure it's inserted. Other things that are usually default within your system are that you are writing on letter-sized paper. If you're not sure if you are, you can click Layout at the top of Microsoft Word and look at Size. Size should say letter, which if you have your your Microsoft Office set up to imperial units will be 8.5 by 11 inches. I have mine set up in metrics, so mine says 21.59 centimeters by 27.94 centimeters. This is the default setting though, so unless you've changed it in the past, it should not be something you need to worry about. The other thing you need to be aware of is that you are expected to have 1-inch margins on all sides. This is also the default for Microsoft Word, and you can check it by clicking on margins, which is also under layout, and selecting the normal layout where it says, and again, mine is in metric, so mine goes 2.54 centimeters from top, left, bottom, and right. They're all the same. Again, that's the default, so unless you have changed something in the past, it should be okay. All your writing should be double spaced again, except for the title page and headings. All your text should also be what's called left flush, which means that it's all lined up against the left-hand side. Under the home here, you have some different options for the way it is flush, or sometimes it's called justification. Left flush is the one furthest to the left, and if you put your mouse over it, it will say align left. And this is what we want for most of the writing in our documents. Other ones that we will use in other parts are center. So center is used on the title page for the information you put on there. You will never use right flush in this kind of formatting. The only time I've seen right flush used is for design and style things. So you'll notice everything gets flushed to the the right hand side. There's also something here called justify, which stretches out your writing so that it's lined up on the left and on the right. This is sometimes used in some documents, but it actually is more difficult to read because the spacing changes depending on what words are in there. So by default, try to keep your alignment to the left. Whenever you have a new paragraph in your writing, you also want to indent it. So if I had a bunch of paragraphs, I don't want them to be stuck to the left-hand side. I want to go ahead of my paragraph, and I'm going to hit the Tab key on my keyboard, and that will automatically indent it. And what this does is this indicates when we have a new paragraph, so it becomes easier to see the structure, which improves the readability. Now, I note here on the second page after the title page, we put the title at the top of the page. So your title might be How to Write in English. So right now this is left flush. This is one of the examples where we would center it. And in this case, it's also bold because it's what we call a heading. So the title of our essay, and this would usually be on the second page, but we haven't gone over how to do a title page yet. So right now it's at the top of my first page. And if you're ever not sure, the APA Style Guidelines website will indicate to you examples, and there are examples available, including these ones in the notes. Now the title page. So your title page is going to be that separate page that begins your document. So I'm going to use this same document. Here I've started my writing, but I need to include my title page. So I'm going to do a quick trick called a page break, and you can find this under Insert, and then right to my left-hand side is Page Break. You can also get this by hitting Control and Enter together. That will automatically move it to the next page. So now I have my title page here. Your title information is going to be centered, just like what we have here on this example. I recommend hitting Enter a few times. keeps wanting to go to the next page. What is that? So don't put all your title page information right at the top of your paper. You want to move it, try to get it sort of in the middle of your page. So I have to hit Control Return again here to get that on its own page. And so I'm going to start by writing the title of my essay. So my title was How to Write in English. Now, again, your title, we're going to make that center, and I'm going to make it bold. Below your title, and this is where you'll want to take off the bold, so make sure it's not pushed down in the little tab here. The next thing we want is your name, and it needs to be your first and last name. So for me, I'd write Lara Ripkins, and then I'd hit Enter. This is sort of like who it's by, what you put below the title. The next line is what we call the affiliation. So your affiliation is your program, comma, Portage College. So if you are an ELCC, you go ELCC certificate, comma, Portage College. Please make sure you spell college correctly. If you spell COLLAGE, that says collage, which is a form of arts and crafts. So make sure you've spelled that correctly. If you're in the EA certificate, then this will be EA certificate. If you are going into your second year, still expected to use APA, but that certificate would become now a diploma. So it's whatever program you are currently in goes here, comma, Portage College, which is the college you are doing the course in. The next thing you have is the course name and number. So this course is ENGL 100. So that's the course code. And then colon, written communication. That's the actual name of the course. It's not English 100. It's actually written communication. It's just that all courses that share the same sort of theme, in as much as it's writing, has that beginning. The next thing you have is the instructor's name. So this is going to look a little bit funny because I've already put my name in, but your instructor for this course is me. So you would have Lara Ripkins here. You do not include any credentials. You don't identify who this is. By its structure, we know that the person who's right under the title is who wrote it, and the person who is right under the course name is the instructor. And then finally, you're going to have the due date. So this is specifically the date it is due. Now in this course, your due date is the one that you set for yourself in Module 1. In other courses, you will be given specific due dates for your assignments. And so it doesn't matter if you submit it before the due date or if you have an extension and you submit it after the due date, you still always put in what the due date is. So this will be based on what the instructor has set as the due date for that assignment. For your due date, you always write out the full month. So I'm doing this in March, comma, the day, it's the 3rd, and then 2025. So you always write out the full month name. You don't shorten it. And I know for people who come from other places, sometimes this format of dating is a little bit weird. And it is for me too. Usually I want to organize my date from largest unit to smallest unit or smallest unit to largest unit. Somehow in academia, for whatever reason, we've gone middlest unit, so a month is larger than a day, but smaller than a year. So we go middle to our smallest unit, which is what day, to our largest unit. So most places in the world don't do that, but on your title pages, this is what you would have there. Your title page should also be double spaced. I do ask that you check on making sure the name of the instructor is also spelled correctly. As you expect your names to be spelled correctly to show respect, so too should you make the attempt to write the person's name accurately. So that's what your title page should look like. And again, it had no impact on the writing in your document because we did that page break. The only time it would impact that is if we went over. So if I kept going down, now it's going to move. But so long as I'm writing just on my title page, it does not get impacted. So do take advantage of that page break function because many students aren't aware that they can use that. They're trying to do weird spacing before they submit or hitting enter a bunch of times. Use the page break, so much easier. And again, on the APA website, there are examples of how title pages should look. Now, headings. You've already done a couple headings, or at least I have, because on our title page, we had a heading, and it was our title. And we repeat that at the top of our second page where the writing begins. This is usually all you'll ever have to be worried about with headings. However, sometimes you might see document or you might be expected to do a little bit more in your writing where we have different headings. Now, a heading is just sort of the beginning of information on a topic. So if you ever look at a textbook, you'll see how it's broken up in different levels of text, depending on if it's a chapter, which would get the biggest text, and then get smaller or less colorful as it goes down into different subsections. Again, you generally only ever have to use what's called a level 1 heading, which is when we center and bold a heading, and that would be what happens with your title and the repeat of your title on the second page. Sometimes we might use a second level heading, which is going to be bold and flush to the left. Now, there are other ones you might see when you are looking at sources, but generally speaking, we don't tend to use these too much in the program because they're used when documents are much, much larger than an assignment level. If you're not sure, you can also always check in the APA website. Now, your reference page. Your reference page is the full information of the sources that you have used or borrowed information from for your writing. It's also a separate page, so it shouldn't show up at the bottom of your writing. I should not see somebody write references just below their writing. Instead, it should also be on its own page. So I'm going to use that page break function again, and it will put it on its own page. Now the word references should be centered. So I'm going to center that, and I'm going to bold it at the top of where I'm starting it. But then I want to change that back so nothing's bold and so that it's left flush. And this is now where I'm going to list the full addresses of my sources that I've used. Your sources should be put in order by alphabetical author name. So you'll have, for your essay, a minimum of 3 sources. And so you want to make sure those are listed in alphabetical order by the author. Now I'm just going to grab a few pretend sources for this pretend paper, so I can demonstrate what this might look like when you're trying to format it. So I'm actually just going to grab some of the sources for this module. I'm just copying and pasting them in the other document here. All right, so I've added 3 sources from this module. Now, right now, they're all left flush and they're all just sort of sitting there. You'll notice that I put them in alphabetical order. My first source author is Booth. My next source author is the Excelsior Online Writing Lab. And my third source is Gallant. And we'll go over what your references look like in a bit here. Now, this, however, is not all we do. You also need to use what's called a hanging indent. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight all our references. So I roll over them with my mouse. And just like double spacing, there are 2 ways to do this. I can right click and go to paragraph. And then under indentation, which is in the center, I go to special and I select hanging. If I hit OK, you'll notice it sort of does the opposite of what we do with paragraphs. Instead of indenting the beginning, it indents any line that comes after. And the reason they do this is so that we know when one reference ends and another begins. So that's the best way to do that, is to highlight it and then use right-click paragraphs and then choose the hanging indent. Again, if you are not sure, the APA website does have examples of these pages. Now, other things we need to watch out for when we're using APA is what's called seriation. Seriation are when we use bullets or numbers to make lists of things. In an essay at the college or university level, we generally don't include seriation. If you were to make a slideshow for an assignment in another course, you can use seriation for listing information, just like I have here in my presentation. We use bullets, like these little black dots here, when the order of information does not matter. And we use numbering, which we use the Hindu Arabic symbols for, what we generally associate our number systems, when the list does have an order that is required. Now, one of the reasons we tend not to use bullets or numbering when we are doing a paper in APA is because you need to use complete sentences, which generally defeats the purpose of using a bulleted list in a paper. So you should not expect to use bullets or numbering in the assignments for this course. You might use it in another course if you are asked to create a PowerPoint or some sort of other product for an assignment. Now, big deal here, because this is how we demonstrate that we are not plagiarizing or misusing information. And that is how we include our evidence and examples. If you're asked to provide evidence, examples, if you're told to justify your response or use research sources, what you are being asked to do is include paraphrased information from other sources within your writing. So paraphrasing is what we generally focus on in academic writing, because it summarizes the information that you need to include. It is written in your own words, so it does not change up the way the writing sounds when it is being read. And it still follows with other ways to source information. Now, in some assignments or with some instructors, you may be permitted to use quotations, which is when you use the exact words and phrases from the author. With those, you need to cite and reference. What we focus on more at the college and university level is paraphrasing. So this is where you're borrowing information from a source, but you're writing it in your own words. we still need to cite and reference because that information has been borrowed from somewhere else. The other one we might see is what's called summarizing, which is when you essentially take a whole source and summarize it. So this only happens if we are writing about the results of a big research paper or the total summary of a book. But if you're just taking a bit of information from a larger source, most of the time that's going to be paraphrasing. And no matter what, if we got information or ideas or examples from another source, we need to cite and reference. Quotations, again, we generally do not use because it breaks up the voice within our writing, which can be quite jarring for the reader. And it is not something that as instructors we can mark because that is somebody else's writing. That's not your writing. You're just taking somebody else's writing and putting it into your stuff. In the event you are permitted to use quotations in your assignments, you also have to count how many words you're using. If it's more than 40 words, you need to go and look up what's called block formatting, because that is a very long quote, and so it has a very special style. That being said, there is no point in any course within the program that you should need to quote that much information. Now, paraphrasing, this is what we love. This is writing things in your own words, and that helps keep the voice of your writing consistent, which means it's easier to read. It tells me as an instructor that you understand what the information is enough to put it into your own words, and it reduces your chances of accidental plagiarism. So just to compare quotations and paraphrasing, and we'll get some more details on parts of this momentarily, if a source said the Canadian lynx is a solitary and elusive feline found primarily in the boreal forests of Canada and parts of the northern United States. It is well adapted to cold environments with thick fur and large snowshoe-like paws that help it navigate deep snow. The lynx primarily hunts snowshoe hares, and its population often fluctuates in response to the hare population cycle. Now, this is written in a book by A. Smith. It was published in 2021, and this information comes from page 5. So, if we were to quote information from this source, what we'd use are some introductory words to introduce it. So, according to Smith, so we only ever use the author's last names in our writing, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. When we look at word choice, we put in brackets after the author's name the year it was published. The Canadian lynx is, and now I'm going to use things word for word from the source, a solitary and elusive feline. So that is exactly what is written up in the original source. And this came from page 5 of that source. Notice that, and we'll talk about this more, the period comes after the page number. Now, if I'm paraphrasing this, I'm still using that same information, but I'm writing it in my own words. So according to Smith, Canadian lynx are difficult to find and live on their own. So the same information is there, but I've written it in my own words. And so I still have that author name, the publication date, and the page number that information comes from. The difference is, do I take it word for word or do I write it in my own words? Now, whether or not we're quoting or paraphrasing, we still need to introduce other source information in our own words. One of the biggest challenges I see sometimes with instructors who allow students to use quotations is that sometimes students will just use a quotation and they just put it in as a sentence by itself without introduction or without any follow-up. It's just this quote in the middle of all your writing that has no linkage to anything else. So quotes should never be a sentence by themselves. When we are introducing information from another source, and we do the author's name as part of our own writing, it's called a narrative citation because we're including the author's name in our narrative. So as an example, we might say Jones. In the brackets after that, we put the year of publication, said that cheddar cheese is the most appreciated cheese in history. And then at the end of that, I put the page number I got that information from before the period. But we can also not include the author's name as part of what we would say out loud. So anything that's in brackets generally means we would not read that out loud. So in this case, we call it a parenthetical citation, and where all the information is at the end of the sentence, that is borrowing that information. So instead of what I have for Jones, I would say some experts have stated that cheddar cheese is the most appreciated cheese in history. So now in brackets at the end of that sentence, I write the author's last name, comma, and then a space, the year it was published, comma, and then a space, and then I indicate that information came from page 27 of that source. Again, notice that the period comes after the parentheses because when you have borrowed information, you need to include that citation as part of that sentence. Now within Horkoff and as part of the reading for this module, there are strong verbs that help you to introduce information borrowed from others. Again, the structure of this is that we always have an author, and in some cases we'll have more than one, so we'll look at examples of that. Then the year of publication comes next, and then the location. Location is the page it comes from. We'll look at some other sources where the location can be something other than page as well. And so your citations in your writing, whenever you're borrowing information, these are the short pieces of information that indicate to the reader that this information has been borrowed or come from somebody else. And we should always have author, last name, year, and page. And they always go in that order, whether it's narrative or if I look at parenthetical, it's author, year, page. So oftentimes citations and references are used interchangeably. But when we're talking about what we're doing for APA, they have different meanings. So those examples we just went through were citations. This is what is in your writing that indicates you have borrowed or gathered this information from another source. Sometimes they're also called in-text citations. And so, for example, in your writing, you might be writing about great inventions from women. And so as part of your writing, you might say, according to able men, there are numerous reasons to be interested in helicopters. And then later on in your writing, you might say, well, no one woman invented the computer. It was women who led the programming revolution. So this first one here is another example of a narrative citation. The one below it is a parenthetical citation. By the way, it doesn't matter which one you use, so long as you are citing information that you have borrowed from other sources. Some people prefer to use narrative. Some people prefer to use parenthetical. It is up to you, so long as you are doing it accurately. So your citations are that short bit of information that include author, year, and the location. In your references, this is the full address of that information. So if I am reading your paper and I'm like, that's interesting, I would like to know more about what this author has said, I will say, okay, so that's Abelman in 2014. So then I'll go to my references and I'll have the full information on that source. which will be starting with the author's last name, Abelman. And in APA, we never write out the first or middle names. We just use initials. So Abelman, comma, and then his first initial is J, period. In the references, then we have the year again, period. We'll have the title of the source and who published it or where it's hosted. And we'll look at different examples of these as we go along. So this part here will not include the location. The locations occur in your citations because you might cite a specific reference multiple times. And so the page numbers, just like in the example here, will be different to acknowledge that on page 26 we got this information, but on pages 67 to 69 we got this other information. But it's from the same source. So there are a lot of different places we can borrow information from. Books are the obvious one because that's what citation and referencing formats were initially developed around, but you will be expected to, for the module 7 and 8 outline and essay, be expected to use a journal article as at least one source. Reference materials like dictionary, thesauri, or encyclopedias can be used as sources. Government statutes, which are any sort of legislation, laws, or policies. Videos, podcasts, AI tools, interviews. There's so many things that we can use as source information. Now, our references, if we have a reference, we can cite it multiple times throughout our writing. But you shouldn't have duplications of your references. They should just be listed once in your references. Again, your parenthetical citations will have that author information, year of publication, and location of the information at the end of the sentence in parentheses, but before the period. Or if you're using narrative citation, we use the author's last name, the year it was published in brackets right after the author's last name, and then at the end of the sentence, but before the period, we have the page number that information came from. Again, make sure your citation is part of the sentence where the information is being discussed. Another thing to note here is that some reference and citation formats will ask you to also include any sources you looked at when you were trying to develop ideas or research around the topic you are writing on. In APA, the only things that are in references are what we are actually citing. So if you're not citing information in your writing from a source, that source should not be part of your references. So, some comparison again between citations and references, and I go over this because sometimes people do get confused. All citations should have the identification of the author, or there might be more than one authors, and we'll look at what that looks like. And we only ever use the last names. An author can also be an organization or a government or things like that. And we'll look at some examples there. The year of publication always has to be included within your citations, and the location of the information within that source. The only time we don't include a location, which is again your page numbers, is when you are doing a summary of the entire source. Whereas your references will include last name of the authors as well as first and middle initials, but again, we don't use the full first names, the year of publication, and additionally the month and day if we are given one, the title of the source, who publishes or hosts the source, and then some specific types of references have specific additional information that is required. So, as an example, in my writing, I might write this. Gordon and Cooey found compelling data to suggest that a person's career outcomes in adulthood are more a product of quality of childhood relationships with parents rather than the quality of education that person received. So again, in here, I have my author last names, Gordon and Cooey. I have the year that that source was published. And in this case, I have the pages that I got that information from. If I'm using more than one page, I use a double P. And then on my reference page, I'll have the full address of that source. So Gordon, comma, and his first initial is M, period, comma. Here I'm going to use the ampersand symbol. So I'm going to use this and symbol instead of writing the word and like I do in my writing. Cooey, comma, and his first initial is M, period. The year of publication. The full name of this source or this particular document is Positive Parenting During Adolescence and Career Success in Young Adulthood. So this is the title, but I know that this is an article because it's not italicized. It doesn't have that slanted font for the title. Instead, that applies to the name of the journal which it was published in. So this was published in the Journal of Child and Family Studies. And then we'll go over these pieces in some more slides coming up. But it happened in volume 24, issue 3, on pages 762 to 771. And then there is a special web address for journal articles. And again, we'll go over this momentarily. So the basic format for references and citations. So your very, very basic format is you're going to have author, start with the author last name, then any initials, the year of publication, the title of the source, and then there, if it has a subtitle, which is like an additional title to that, you include that next after the colon. If there is an addition, you put it in brackets, you have a period, and then you write down the name of the publisher. So, for example, here, I have this textbook, Children, A Chronological Approach. It's the 6th Canadian edition, and it was written by Robert V. Cale and Teresa Zollner. So my references, if I was using this book as a source of information, my first author, I'm going to start with the last name. I'm going to start with Cale, comma, and then the initials. So I have Robert V, so it would be R period V period, comma. And I have another author, so I'm going to use this and symbol here, Teresa Zollner. So I take the Zollner first, comma, T period. So those are the authors. Next, this was published in 2021. Usually you need to open up the cover of a book in order to figure out when it is published. There is usually that page which includes the copyright information and printing information, and that is where you will get the year of publication. There's also a period after that. Then the title of this book is Children. So that's the main title. So I have here Children, but it also has a subtitle. So I'm going to use the colon here. The subtitle is always written in a smaller size. So usually it comes below the main title, but we will see an example where it comes above the main title. The difference is going to be the size of the text. So it is A Chronological Approach is the subtitle. This is the 6th Canadian edition. So it says that over in the corner. So in the brackets, I'd write 6th Canadian edition. ED with a lowercase e is short for edition. You can also just write CAN period if you wanted to instead of writing out Canadian, but there's no rules about that. And this was published by Pearson. So some things to note about the way the title is written specifically is that we always use what's called sentence case when we are writing our titles, at least in our references. Sentence case is where we capitalize the first letter of the title and the subtitle, but we don't capitalize the other words unless they are proper nouns. So if it's the name of a place or a person, we would still capitalize it, but the other terms are not capitalized. So even though on the textbook they have capitalized chronological and they have capitalized approach, we do not do that in our reference. So here we've got another example of a book. Here it's so much work to be your friend, helping the child with learning disabilities find social success. And I've read it that way because, and this might be a little bit difficult to see depending on your screen size, this text here is a larger size than the text above it. So that means the main title is It's So Much Work to Be Your Friend, and the subtitle is Helping the Child with Learning Disabilities Find Social Success. This is written by Richard Lavoie. Now it does indicate that it has a preface as well as a foreword, but we only include the main author's name or names if there was more than one author. Those additional things, the preface and the foreword, are additional pieces that don't get accounted for within our reference. So Richard Lavoie becomes Lavoie, R period. Again, you have to look inside the cover to find the year of publication. So this came from 2006. My main title, It's So Much Work to Be Your Friend, then colon. The subtitle is Helping the Child with Learning Disabilities Find Social Success. Again, notice that even though on the cover certain words are capitalized, they are not going to be capitalized in our reference. And this was published by Atria Books, which you can usually find again inside the book itself or on the side of the book. Now, that's what the reference would be. So that's what would be on my references page. In my own writing, if I've borrowed information from this book, I might do it like this. So one of the strategies Lavoie suggests for children who have separation anxiety is having them help with planning, shopping, and packing if there is going to be a trip. So here, all I'm using is the author's last name, that year right after, and at the end of the sentence, what page that information came from. For children who may have a delayed response to a traumatic event, it is important to be supportive and encourage the child to express their feelings and worries. So here's an example of a parenthetical citation for this book. So author last name, Lavoie, comma space, the year of publication, comma space, and because I'm talking about information from more than one page, I would use a double P, period, pages 40 to 41. So this part here is in your own writing. The reference is what's in the back with that list of sources. Now, if we have two authors who've written a book, very similar to everything else, we're going to focus on the use of the last name. So I have Kenneth Strike as my first author. So it would be Strike, comma, K, period. And then I have my and symbol. And the other author is Jonah F. Soltis. So I go Soltis, comma, J period, F period. Okay, this was published in 2009. I got that information from inside the cover. This book is called The Ethics of Teaching. Again, notice that even though everything is in all capital letters on the book, I am only putting the first word as a capital. It is the 5th edition, so I could go right after the title here and write 5th ed, lowercase e. Also notice that the addition parts are not italicized. It's just the title. And this was printed by Teachers College Press. So if I was borrowing information for my writing from this source, I might say Strike and Soltis argue that schools can only be considered democratic institutions if they ensure all students and staff get equal opportunities to do well. So notice, if I'm doing a narrative citation, I use the word and between the author's names. But if I'm doing a parenthetical citation like the next one here, it is in the interests of educators to improve student achievement, not only because it supports the students, but because it helps economic productivity. So in this case, I did not use the author's names within my own words that I would read out loud. So I'm going to have Strike and Soltis, but in this case, I use that and symbol. So you have to watch out. If it's part of your own writing, you write the word and. If it's within the brackets here, as part of a parenthetical citation, we use the symbol for and. Now, what about 3 or more authors? Well, our references don't really change much in this regard. So here there are 5 authors for this textbook. James Levin, James F. Nolan, James W. Kerr, Anne E. Elliott, and Mira Bajovic. So I'm going to just list them all out again, just their last name, comma, and then any initials for first, and sometimes they have a middle name. So Levin, comma, J period. Now I'm going to comma, start the next author name, Nolan, comma, J period, F period, comma for the next author. And I do this for each of the authors, and before the last author, I use the and symbol. So it's just making a list, and then an and comes before the last author's name. This was published in 2015. This is called Principles of Classroom Management. It's the 4th Canadian edition, so here again, 4th. This case, I shorten Canadian to CAN, which is acceptable. Pearson Canada is the one who published it. So this would what be in your references. And then in your writing, we have a little bit of a different thing. So if I had to list out all those authors as part of my writing, that would start to take up a lot of space in my writing. So the instant we have 3 or more authors, we get to use something special, et al. So we give the first author's last name, in this case it's Levin, and then we, after his name, we put et al. Et al means and others. It's Latin for that. We put the year. So Levin et al. Identify that educators who let natural consequences occur when safe better support students in learning from experiences. So that information came from page 111 of that book. The culture of a school needs to be positive and responsive to support development of healthy behaviors in children. So in this case, I'm using a parenthetical citation, but again, because if I list all the authors' names, it's going to become much too busy in my writing. And I want the writing to be focused on the writing, not the sources. So I'm going to use Levin et al. Again, comma, 2015, comma, and then the pages, in this case, where I pulled that information from. So if you have 3 or more authors, remember the et al. For the writing part. In your references, you still list them all out, but in your writing, where you have the citations, you use et al. Now, you are also likely to come across books that have editors instead of authors. So where there's editors, that means that this is often multiple people have written, maybe somebody has written a different chapter for each thing, but you have editors who make sure that the writing and the formatting is consistent. If you have editors, we treat them like authors with one change in the reference. So here I have 3 editors, and if they're editors, it's noted by their names somewhere. So I have Nancy File, Nancy E. Barbour, and Andrew J. Stremmel. So same thing, I take their last name, File, comma, N period. So that's Nancy File, Barbour, N-E, and then and Stremmel, A-J. The thing I need to add in my reference is EDS, and notice that this is a capital E now. So we have to be very careful if we capitalize or don't capitalize, because you'll notice on the other examples we've had additions. Additions is going to be lowercase ed. Editors will be uppercase ed. This was printed in 2024. The title of this is 7 Crucial Conversations in Early Childhood Education. Notice there's a subtitle. It's a little bit smaller down here. Where have we been and why does it matter? And this was printed by Teachers College Press. Now, it doesn't change anything if you are citing information from it. We're still going to treat it as if the editors are authors. So because there are 3 or more editors, authors in this case, we just use the first author's last name, and then we use et al. In our citations, just like we did for the last one. So File et al. State how the preschool entry examinations in some states have left about half preschool-aged children excluded from early childhood education programs due to living in poverty. So that comes from page 19 of this book. Educators that have honest and open discussions on early childhood education practices improve their knowledge and skills. So in this case, I'm using a parenthetical citation, but I still do the same thing. File et al., year of publication, page where the information came from. Now, occasionally, and hopefully this won't be too often because it's a bit of a pain, but sometimes you might just have only a chapter out of a bigger book. If that is the case, we have a really funky looking form for referencing here. So if I only have one chapter out of this book, Teaching Adult Literacy, and this is something that it's a book that has different authors for each chapter, then if I only have that chapter, I'm going to treat the author chapters as the authors. So in that book, there is a chapter by Derek J. and Gon J. This book was printed in 2010. The name of the chapter is Planning and Assessment. So you'll notice the name of the chapter does not have italicization. That's on purpose because since it's a part of a larger document, the larger document gets that special title treatment. The next part is where we see some different stuff. So we note that this chapter is in N. Hughes and I. Schwab. So those are the editors of this book. And notice how we put the letters, instead of after, we put them in front. Not sure why they did it this way, but these are the rules, and so we're going to follow them. They are the editors, so after their names, I put EDS with the capital E in brackets. I use a comma. I put the name of the book here, Teaching Adult Literacy, Principles and Practice. And then, and this is probably the only time aside from journal articles you'll include pages as part of your reference, is what pages the chapter comes from. So this chapter is from pages 278 to 309, and this book was published by Open University Press. Now, if I'm borrowing information from this chapter in my writing, I would say Derek and Gon state that good educators have a variety of questioning techniques that support student learning. So this came from page 298. Or if I'm using a parenthetical citation, it might look like this. Educators should avoid the use of closed questions during learning, as closed questions do not promote student learning or critical thinking development. Okay, again, we've got to watch out because when we have two authors, we use and when we're including their names in our writing. But if we're putting them in a parenthetical citation at the end, we're going to use this symbol called ampersand. Now, some documents you might use will be written by an organization or a government for that matter. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody in the government or everybody in the organization wrote this. For example, I used to work at Alberta Education, and I wrote many documents that have since been published. But because my work was done under Alberta Education, they're the ones who have credit for it. It was part of my job to do that for them. So in those cases, it is the organization that gets the credit for being the author. So this document here, supporting positive behavior in Alberta schools, Alberta Education is the author of it. So that in Alberta is like a Ministry of Education. It's just called Alberta Education. We end our authors always with a period, even if it looks funny. The year of publication in brackets, again with a period after. The title of this document, Supporting Positive Behavior in Alberta Schools. Notice that we still keep Alberta capitalized because that is a proper noun. Colon, an intensive individualized approach. Now, this particular document is hosted on the Government of Alberta site. So anything that comes from a government, if it comes from a specific ministry or department in government, you always have to acknowledge that this is part of the government of, and then whatever government it's part of. So in this case, it's Government of Alberta. That would be the host or the publisher. And then if the link to that document, and most documents now are available online, so I would expect to see a link following all this. Now, if the document is written by an organization, then we treat that organization name as the author. So for example, from this document, Alberta Education recommends that educators pay attention to the types of behaviors demonstrated by children to help doctors with diagnoses. So that information came from pages 82 to 83 of this document. In the event a child poses a safety risk to themselves, others, or property, a crisis management plan should be developed. So if I'm not including the author in my own writing, then I have to put it in citation at the end of the sentence. There's that organization name, comma, the year, comma, and the page that information came from. Now, there are some organizations that might also go by an acronym. So if you think about NASA, for example, NASA is an acronym that stands for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So you'd actually have to write that all out, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And then after you've given the full name, you can put in brackets behind it, NASA, to show that that is the shorthand version of that name. Now, occasionally, for some courses, you might also need to cite and reference information from statutes. And a statute is any sort of law or legal source. So it could be acts, like those of you who are in early learning and childcare have to function under the Early Learning and Childcare Act. If you are in the EA program, you fall under the Education Act. So if you need to provide information from a source like this, we do it a little bit differently. To begin, we start with the title, and the title is immediately italicized. So here it's the Early Learning and Childcare Act, comma, and then We have a shorthand. So Statutes of Alberta is shortened to SA. Some of the older ones that you might see in Alberta might also have RSA for Revised Statutes of Alberta. And then there's other shorthands, but this would be what that is. So SA stands for Statutes of Alberta. Originally, this was developed in 2007, so it would be Statutes of Alberta 2007, comma. And then all legislation is given an identifier. And so these are called chapters, the way it works in law. So we would have a lowercase c period to indicate a chapter, and then it's E-01 or 0.1. So as it is there. So this is the basic information, but legislation is often updated. And so you'll also have the latest version of updates. So then in brackets after that, we start with the year always. So we go year, then month, then day. So in this case, it was updated November 16, 2022. So we have 2022, comma, we write out the full name of the month. We do not shorten it. And then the day, bracket, period. And then you should be able to find a link to all legislation. In Alberta, you can go onto the King's printer and search up a lot of legislation. Now, if you were to talk about stuff that came out of legislation or laws, we would need to do a little bit different pieces within our writing. So, as an example, according to the Early Learning and Childcare Act, and notice how it's italicized here, because anything that's a title is going to be italicized like that. According to the Early Learning and Childcare Act, a child is anyone who is under the age of 13. Now notice this is not a page number. Instead, when you have legislation, what you have are section numbers. So this is section 1AI. And so this is indicating what part of the document it is from. And we use that because depending on the updates or depending on if you look on it virtually or in a print version, the page name numbers might shift a bit. So instead we reference the section number. Or if I'm doing a parenthetical citation, providers of childcare programs need to ensure children have care and play experiences that support their learning and that children are protected from all forms of abuse. And so I acknowledge I get this information from the Early Learning and Childcare Act. Again, it's italicized, comma. This was last updated in 2022, so we always use the year of last update. Notice that we don't include the November or the 16th. That only is in the reference. We want to keep things as short as possible within our own writing. So we just use the year. And this particular information comes from section 1.2. Now, sometimes you might be reading a source and that source quotes or mentions somebody else and what they have said on a topic. And you might think, wow, what that person said is really helpful, but I don't have the source that they originally wrote or spoke about it in. This is what we call a secondary source, where somebody that you are looking at references somebody else. And so what we do in our citations is we just add a little bit. So here is this book again that we have referenced, and we would keep the reference the same in our references. We're not going to change anything for our reference. But what we might do within our citations in order to acknowledge that these authors have borrowed the words or information of others is we'll acknowledge them through making some indication within our citation. So for example, if the authors have quoted Hilary Putnam in this book, which they do, what we say then is Putnam discusses how the traditions and cultures we are raised in influence our sense of right and wrong. So we don't do what we would normally do with the authors and put the date right after in this case, because we want to acknowledge that this is as cited in Strike and Solstice. So this is saying that they borrowed this information from Putnam within their own book. This book was published in 2009, and that reference or that citation is on page 97. Alternatively, if I don't include who said that originally, I could write it as what people consider right or wrong often relates back to the traditions and cultures in which they are raised. And so in this case, I include the original author or speaker's last name, comma, but then I also add in that as cited in Strike and Solstice, 2009, page 97. Now, journal articles. Journal articles go by a lot of different names. They might be called scholarly articles or periodicals. It's all the same sort of idea. What we're talking about here are journals, which are like magazines, but they're focused on people who have a background in that area. And there are literally journals and periodicals for every sort of field and subject area. And it's where people who have a background in that area, who are doing research in that area, will publish their results. And you need to have at least one scholarly journal article for your assignment for the outline and the essay in this course. And we often emphasize these because they are coming from credible individuals, and in journals, they are usually reviewed by peers before they are published, which means that other people who have that same background will review what is being written to make sure it is factual and accurate and understandable. So we know then that it should be credible as well. We should be able to trust what is being said in this kind of source. Now, for a journal article, and most of them you will find online now, some of them you will need to access through the Portage College Library online, because some otherwise you will not be able to access because you need to go through your college account. But there are lots of sources you can find this way that are very useful. So this one here, and it might be difficult to see because the text is small, this was written by J.S. Grady, M. Herr, J. Morano, C. Perez, and J. Yelenick. So we list out all the authors of this article, just like we would anything else. It was published in 2019. Some journals and some periodicals might also have a month and day. So if that's the case, after the year, you go comma, month written out fully, and day. The name of this article is Emotions in Storybooks, and the subtitle, A Comparison of Storybooks that Represent Ethnic and Racial Groups in the United States. Notice that is not italicized because this is one part of a much larger piece. And that much larger piece is Psychology of Popular Media Culture. So this is the journal it was published in. And so that part gets italicized. We use a comma. And the next thing we have here is the volume. The volume is how many years this publication has been in print for. And so this journal has 8 years since the start of them beginning to print it. Now, you might also, on top of a volume, have what's called an issue number. So if they produce this journal more than once a year, then they will also have an issue number. And so this means that this is the third issue of that year. Not all journals will have an issue number, in which case you don't have anything in brackets after your volume. The volume, by the way, is also italicized, but the issue is not. Again, I don't know why that's the case. I just follow the rules. Now, this particular article shows up on pages 207 to 217 of the journal. Sometimes you might not have specific page numbers if the journal only publishes online. But many journals will publish both online and in a print format, so often they still have page numbers involved. And then you will usually have what's called a DOI, which stands for Digital Object Identifier. Occasionally, you might have a regular web link too. A DOI is created for every journal article so that even if a person changes stuff up on their website or changes links, that is always going to be the same. It's what we call a static link, so that no matter what, we can always go back to it. It's a special place on the internet just for that article. And most journal articles will have them. Sometimes you have to sort of look in different places on the site you're looking, but it will be there. Now, in my writing, if I am borrowing information from this, notice that I have 3 or more authors. So I'm going to use my special et al. And I only use the last name of the first author. So Grady et al. Found that characters from marginalized groups were usually the characters showing strong emotion in children's books. And that information came from page 215. Again, this source goes from pages 207 to 217. So it should be one that exists within those pages. Also note in the reference, we don't indicate pages or anything there. We just have these. It just goes straight to 207 to 217. Alternatively, we could go children identify with characters that they recognize themselves in. So educators should make sure they have books that have characters from a variety of backgrounds. So if I am not introducing the author's name in my writing, I put it in the parenthetical citation at the end, Grady et al., comma, published in 2019, comma, and this information came from page 213. Some additional notes on journal articles, because it can depend on where the journal article came from. So for example, if you don't have a journal article that has page numbers, you still have to indicate a location. And instead of a page number, you're going to use a paragraph number. And so we use the shorthand of para with a period there instead of page. That's short for paragraph. And so we actually do need to count how many paragraphs down on a website, virtual, that information came from. If we have information coming from more than one paragraph, then we just we go paras, period. Now, most of those articles will have that digital object identifier. If you can't find any, make sure you use the regular web link at the end. Again, the volume is the year that journal has been in publication. Issue number is if it's published more than once a year, then it'll be indicated in brackets afterwards. Not all journals publish more than once a year though, so you might not always have an issue number. Now, often there will be drafted references within the Portage College Library database, or even in Google Scholar or other sources where you can find journal articles. You still need to make sure that they're done correctly, because sometimes those references have been generated by artificial intelligence. And unfortunately, artificial intelligence as of today is still not that good at making references accurately. So you still need to check that information to make sure it fits. Now, news articles. Generally speaking, we don't use news articles as sources unless we are talking about current events or issues. Because a news article is meant to get newspapers sold or to get clicks on websites that hold the news. So they're not always the most accurate source of information. I do believe that journalists are generally trying to be accurate, but they are not writing for specialists, they're writing for the general public. So the language is often reduced and the information might include pieces from interviews or other sources that might be biased. However, if you are going to use a news source for a assignment, we treat the person who wrote it as the author. So this was written by Andrea Morehouse. So it would be Morehouse, comma, a period. It was published on June 16th, 2024. So we always go year, comma, or sorry, July 16th. It's very small on my screen too. So then we write out July fully, 16. If there is an update, so sometimes a news article might come out that then has to be updated because some information was inaccurate, we use the update day. So whatever is the last day that it was reviewed, essentially. And so this is opinion. Alberta's grizzly bear management should be science-based. Notice that the name of the article is not italicized. However, the source, the news source that it came from is, and that's because, again, this is a small part of a much bigger source. So it's the Edmonton Journal that becomes italicized, and then we put in the web link. So that would be the references for that source. In your writing, if you were talking about information from this article, we could say Morehouse explains that human-bear interactions can be dangerous to humans. Notice here, I'm indicating it comes from paragraph 2, that information. So I have to count down the paragraphs to figure out which paragraph that information came from. Hunting has not been shown to be effective for managing bear populations, and instead non-lethal proven methods should be used. So here I have a parenthetical citation, Morehouse, comma, the year of publication. Again, I'm not putting specific days or months in, it's just the year. And then this information came from paragraphs 3 to 5. So again, you do need to count down those paragraphs. If you're using any sort of website as a source, you still have to do that. The location has to be included unless you're summarizing the entire thing. So similarly, if we have a document that's found online, it will often follow the same process. So we list out the authors, the year, and this one should be quite familiar to anybody who's in ELCC because this is a source document you might use over and over. And so in this case, these author names were found inside the document with that copyright information and publication date. So we list out the authors who wrote this. It's 2014 it was published. This is Flight, Alberta's Early Learning and Childcare Framework, and then the link. So within our writings, if we're borrowing information from this document, we'd start again with that first author last name, and because there's 3 or more authors, we use et al. So Makakovichuk et al. State that is important for children to be able to be involved in decision making, express opinions, and speak against perceived acts of injustice. And this is on page 84 of that document. And a lot of online documents will still have page numbers. If they don't, then you have to use paragraphs. Children need to be able to play outside in nature and engage with the land. And this comes from Flight Framework. So we write the author's first name, and then because there's 3 or more authors, we have that et al. 2014, and that came from page 21. Now, there's a lot of good information that exists in video format as well. The most commonly used one is YouTube videos, but this can be amended for other video sources as well. If we are using a video online, we still need to make sure that whoever is speaking or talking is credible, has a background in that information. Unfortunately, there are lots of videos on YouTube as well as other sites which are largely opinion based and some even conspiracy theory based. So if you are using a video source, you need to make sure that whoever is speaking or presenting does have a background in that topic such that maybe they have a university degree in it, they present on it, they teach about it, they do research in it. Here, I have borrowed a source from Harvard University. So this is on some work they are doing at Harvard University. And within a YouTube site, and I'm actually going to pull this one up because not all information is readily available on a YouTube site, at least not in a way that everybody is available to find it easily. So I'm just going to make this smaller so it's not taking up everything. This is the same video that I used for this source. The author is going to be whoever is below the title of the video. In this case, it's Harvard University. So we have Harvard University is the author. To find the date it was published, so below a YouTube video, you have this little information block that's colored a little bit lighter. And if you click on the more, it expands. And then you get at the top the date of publication. So this was published August 28, 2019. We still need to go by year. So 2019, August 28. The name of the video is Soft Robotic Gripper for Jellyfish, just like what's written below, but we're still just going to use that sentence case. Behind the name of that video, I'm going to put into square brackets the word video. And we use this whenever we're using a format that would not be considered a typical reading format. So videos, podcasts, graphics. Anything where we need to indicate what type of file it is, we're going to put in these square brackets after the title. After that, we put down where it is hosted. So this is hosted on YouTube. So you could do the same thing with a video from Netflix. You'd write Netflix here. You could do the same thing on other video search places, but the publisher, the place where it's hosted or held, that's what goes after the name and the type of file. And then you have the link to it. Now you have to be careful with links in YouTube and some other sources, because if I search this up, if I take the link from the top, it's probably also going to include what I looked up to search for it. And so it's going to be really long. Instead, you can get a shorter, more direct version of the link by clicking on share below the video, and then it will pop up with a direct link here that you can copy. And again, I recommend that because if you search this up, it's going to have the information about what you searched up in your search bar at the top. So it'll make the link excessively long. Now, if I'm borrowing information from a video, it's going to look a lot the same with one minor change. So here in this video, Harvard University state that many tools used for underwater exploration are big and pose a danger to jellyfish. Now, I don't have page numbers in here. I don't have paragraph numbers in here. What I have are what are called timestamps. And so this indicates approximately or about when this information starts to be talked about in the video. It doesn't have to be perfectly exact, but it should be about where that information is starting to be talked about. So in this case, we have, this would be minutes, the first two digits, and then a colon, and this would be seconds. If a video is really longer, it goes more than an hour, then you might have 3 sets of digits broken up by colons. But this is what you use for your location. This is where the information is about to come from. A new tool has been developed that allows researchers to collect jellyfish without harming them. So here's a parenthetical citation from this video, Harvard University, 2019, and that information starts being talked to about 30 seconds in. Don't worry about getting this exactly accurate. It should just be close to where the information starts to be discussed. And you can see too, in my image citation here, that I have it paused at 1 second. So I indicate that place there. Now, another source you might find yourself wanting to use for papers and assignments is actually the presentations from classes. So if you have a class presentation or a class itself, or even information that's hosted on the Moodle written by your instructor, you can actually use that as source information too. For example, when I teach this in a regular class, so it's a class, not a module, you'll notice, this is the PowerPoint presentation that I use to teach it within a regular class. So we put the author name. So in this case, it's my last name, Ripkins, comma L. We don't write out my first name. I created this particular one in 2024. The name of the document is English 100, Class 1. You'll notice in the square brackets, I've indicated it's a PowerPoint presentation. Again, we do this whenever it's a non-typical format. So videos, PowerPoints, podcasts, things that would not be just straight reading. Now, something that happens though, if we have a class and we have information from the class, we can't access that unless we are a member of that class. So we don't actually include any web links to this, because if you are reading this paper and you are not in that class, you can't access it. So instead we put down the course name, just the code actually. We don't write out the full name. So English 100, comma, the semester and year it was in, because instructors change their documents all the time. Whenever I get feedback from students about what could be improved, I try to incorporate that feedback into my presentations. So this one was specifically from fall 2024, comma, and Portage College. No web link, because unless you're part of that class, you can't access it. If you were to provide information in your writing from this class, you might do something like this, where it says Ripkins identifies multiple supports for writing, accessibility, and language learning. And in a presentation, you'll notice this here too, I have slide numberings always at the bottom. So that tells me what page is it on. We treat slides the same as we treat pages. So where it says PP here, it means slides 12 to 14. And further to that, within post-secondary, Indigenous knowledge has traditionally been undervalued or dismissed. So here I have a parenthetical citation, last name, year, and the slide number. We don't use S because we use S for sections in legislation. So we just keep it as pages. Now for AI content. First of all, AI use is always at the discretion of the instructor. In this course, as I've noted, you can use AI to review the mechanics of your assignment, or to help you come up with ideas, but you cannot have it right for you. Some instructors will be more restrictive, some instructors will be less restrictive. It is on a case-by-case basis, so always make sure you know what your instructor expects for you. If you are borrowing information from AI, and for example, I can think of one course in the diploma program where we currently do have students go on and get a different definition from an AI tool. And so then they need to be able to cite and reference it. In that case, what we do is we use the developer name. So this is who created that AI tool. Now, usually this should be somewhere obvious because you're on that website. But you can also ask the AI itself. So I often have ChatGPT open and I can ask what or who developed you? And it says I was developed by OpenAI. So that's the company that developed them. So you'll notice here in my example for ChatGPT, I have OpenAI is the author, period. The year, and this was the year it was used. And sometimes you might even want to include the month and the day you used it as well, because as we know, AI is continuously developing. So the response you might get on one day might be different from the response you get on another day. Now, this particular tool is ChatGPT. And if there's a version, and I did this last summer, so it told me that it was the July 17th version. If I ask it now, what version are you? It's probably going to give me something else. Yeah, now they go with a different code. So this is ChatGPT-4-Turbo. So that would be what goes inside those brackets. And I'm specifically including what type of AI tool it is. So if you're using a chat bot like ChatGPT or Windows Copilot or some of the other ones, those are called large language models. And those are the ones that are designed to be able to have conversations or provide information. There are other types of AI tools that are used to produce images or videos or do other things as well. And then you provide the link to just the basic AI tool. You can't access the tool from somebody else, so you guys can't access my ChatGPT history. So we only just include the basic link, not a specific link. And then if I was using this information that I got from here by asking it, write me a brief 1-paragraph sentence on the importance of citation. Here I'm paraphrasing. According to OpenAI, citations support professionalism by avoiding plagiarism and proving credibility to the writing. Notice there are no locations here. This is because the reader cannot check this. I can't go into your AI accounts. You can't go into mine, so I can't determine if there's more than one paragraph or page or however much information. So this is one place aside from summarizing where we would not use a location. Or if I'm doing a parenthetical citation, the accurate use of citations demonstrates to the reader that the writer recognizes their sources and is building off that knowledge. Again, the developer, comma, the year it was used. You don't put in the specific full date of use in your citations. So you notice those square brackets again where we have them to indicate what type of what we call medium the source is. And there is no specific list of mediums. That's part of the benefits is because it's not restrictive, and that's because APA acknowledges that over time, new forms of media develop and are created. In general, though, there's certain things we do tend to see within those square brackets. So if you're using any sort of image, you might want to indicate what type of image it is. So a graphic, a painting, a photograph, a drawing, an infographic. If you are doing a source that's a video form, besides video, you might have a motion picture. I'm not sure why we don't use movie, but that's what I tend to see. If it's a television episode, or maybe you're talking about a whole television series. For digital materials, you might have lecture notes, you might have a PowerPoint, it might be a brochure, it might just be class material. If it's a program, indicating that, or some sort of web material. So, for example, I created this image. Well, I didn't create it. I gave AI the prompt to create this image. So I told it to create a picture that was serene and simple comic style landscape. And so in this case, I used DALL-E, which is also developed by OpenAI. So OpenAI 2024, DALL-E. This one is called diffusion model. You could also just use image generator or something like that. Diffusion model is specifically getting to what kind of AI tool it is. And again, you can access it through the same thing. Now, sometimes there is occasionally the chance that you might need to use a source by the same author that was published in the same year. If this is the case, then in order to differentiate between those sources, we're adding a letter to the references and citations in the year. So if you were to be writing a paper and used information from multiple class presentations, all of those are chances are going to be written by the same person. So all these are written by me, and they were all written in 2024. So in order to differentiate them so that I can cite appropriately, I'm going to add A, B, C. And we just go in terms of the order of the titles. So because the names are all the same, the years are all the same, one is going to correspond to A, two is going to correspond to B, and so forth. That way, when I do my citations, I know which specific class I might be referring to. So if I'm borrowing information from the class 1 PowerPoint, I could say Ripkins identifies multiple supports for writing, accessibility, and language learning. And the only difference I have there is now I have this extra little A here, so that if I need to go and check this source, I know that it's the first one and not the second or third one. Now, there are many, and certainly more than I have linked here, citation and referencing tools online. All of these have their own little spin. People generally like one once they get used to something. There's also in Microsoft Word built-in referencing tools. To be honest, I don't know how to actively use this because I come from the age where we didn't have these tools available. So I had to learn and memorize this all, and now it's just faster for me to do it myself. But if you feel like this could be beneficial for you, there are lots of built-in tools in word processors, as well as tools online that you can use. It is up to you to learn how to use them, though, because I am not a master in all of them. And so it's up to you to determine, is this something that's going to be beneficial to me? There's also a lot of YouTube guides on how to use them that could also be helpful. Now, these are questions I usually get. What if you can't find an author or an editor on a source? If this is the case, that should be a giant red flag that the source you're looking at might not be credible, because you should be able to identify an author to determine if they are a credible and reliable source of information. in APA, we don't use anonymous to identify that there is no author. In fact, that term has a very specific usage outside of citation references. The only place where it might be acceptable to use a source without an author is if you are borrowing a picture or image from the internet to use in a presentation or other assignment that uses visuals. So for example, I found on Google image search this picture of a cute little bee, but I could not find the name of the author or who created it. In this case, I would treat the title as the author. So instead of the title and the type of thing coming after the year, I would instead have it before. So here I have B single clip art. I indicate in the square brackets that this is a graphic, period. I found out it was developed in 2022 and it was being hosted on Etsy. So it was on the Etsy website. And then I have a link to that specific image. This would be the only place that you should be using a source that does not have an author. What about if there's no date? Again, this is usually a red flag. Sometimes people have difficulties finding the date. It's usually, if it's a print source, it's usually within that front cover information. Within an online source, it could be at the top of the site, it could be at the bottom of the site. And sometimes too, a website might have two dates. One might be when it was originally published, and one might be when it was updated. In those cases, you should always use the date of update because that was the last time it would have been reviewed. However, occasionally, sometimes there is no specific date. So for example, I found this document in the Department of Justice Canada, and for the life of me, I couldn't find a date anywhere. Sometimes you can figure out dates from looking at the web link where they might have it included as part of the web link. But in this case, I couldn't find anything, but it was still a good source information. In those cases, instead of having nothing for our date, we use N period D period, which literally means no date. So in this document, I found online that I could not find a date for, but still had a lot of good information. I have here the author is Department of Justice Canada, no date inside the brackets, how children react at different ages and stages. Because this is a government document, I put down the hosting government, so this is Government of Canada, and then the link to the document. In my citations, similarly, and you can see this below here in my picture citation, I say it's from Department of Justice Canada, comma, ND for no date, and this is the first page of that document. What about no title? Again, this can be problematic if you want reliable and credible sources. But again, sometimes, especially with images, there might not be a specific title that you can find easily. So in those cases, you're going to describe what your source is inside of square brackets. So here, this is an Adobe stock photo. So it comes out of a batch of photos that you're free to use if you have an Adobe license. It was created by M. Dine. So I have the creator's name there. I know it was published in 2016 from the information that's online for the Adobe stock images. And where I usually have my title, instead I have square brackets and I am indicating what it is. So I do have a bit of a background in art, so I could tell that this was oil painting. So I said it was an oil painting of a human eye in color, just a short description of what it is. We don't put it in italics because it's not the official title. It's hosted through Adobe Stock Images, And I have the link to those stock images there for anybody else who has that kind of licensing. A lack of a title, though, won't affect your citations because we don't generally include the title in citations. On occasion, we might also have information that the reader will not be able to check personally that is not based in AI or something like that. So this is what we call a personal communication. And personal communications can include emails, they can include personal phone conversations, personal interviews, digital messages like texts, as well as teachings from elders and knowledge holders. Now, because the reader cannot go and check those sources for themselves, we don't have a reference for personal communications. So no reference when we have a personal communication. However, we do have to include some additional information in our citation, where we include the specific date the communication occurred, and depending on the source, we might also include where that person is from. So, for example, if I had an email from somebody whose last name was Smith, um, pretending this is an email, it's a personal communication, Smith, and then in the brackets after I indicate this person's name, I say personal communication, comma. This is the one time we will use more information about the date in our citations. August 11, 2023. Claim that children are more impacted by what adults do than what they say. So this statement here, again, I won't have a reference for this, so that's why I include a little bit more in the citation. You'll notice it goes month, day, year again, sort of like that weird title piece. If it's information you get from an elder or a respected person in a community that has some social standing in some way, I've got here an example from one of my elders. Water is sacred, living, and necessary for all humans. And so here I have an example of a parenthetical citation. Here I'm indicating that it's Elder B. Cardinal. And you don't have to include a first initial in this case, but because there are a lot of elders with the last name of Cardinal out in Enoch, so I differentiate it with the B. He is from Enoch Cree Nation. It's a personal communication, and it occurred September 10th, 2021. So this would be a special case. Now, generally speaking, personal communications aren't always used as academic sources. We can use them where it's somebody who has significant social standing, like an elder. But in just sort of, if you're just texting a friend, that's not a good source of information for academic writing. Now, you might also, in other assignments, you don't have this for your essay or outline, you might want to include images, much like I do every slide on the right-hand side. And if you've been paying attention, you've been seeing that they might follow a predictable pattern in how they are labeled. So any sort of chart, diagram, picture, graph, maps, infographics, and things that we often consider tables, but that might not be considered tables by APA, anything like that that might be included in a presentation or a video or an infographic for other courses. You want to make sure that any images are clear. You don't want fuzzy images. You don't want that stuff with a watermark pushing over it. It needs to be clear. If there's any text within your image or your figure, it needs to be legible. It should not be blurry. Any charts or graphs should have appropriate labeled axes and units of measurement. This is just good math skill. And then to label it, you'll notice that I start with the word figure. And then whichever one it is in the document, and this is the 37th image I've shown in this presentation, so that's why it's 37 up there. So this is figure 37. Below that in italics is the title or description of what the figure is. It is written in title case, you'll notice. All the major words are capitalized. Any connecting words would be lowercase. Below the image, I write the word note. Note is also italicized. And then if it's directly from something, I'll use the word from. Sometimes I create things, so I might say it's been adapted from, so I might have based it on some information, but I might have made it myself, so I might say adapted from and then where I adapted it from. Or if it's an artwork or something, I might say by. And so this comes from the actual APA website, which I have referenced at the end of all the notes. And that would then get, you'd have the full reference in your references pages. So there's no distinction between your writing references and your image or figure references. They all go together in a reference page. And here I have some more example from other sources or other presentations I've done. It's a little bit of inception because you can see I've labeled these as figures, but I also have within where they originally came from, how they look there. So in this first one here, because I've created this model here that shows the different parts of basic operations, I don't have anything in the note below, so there's nothing in this actual part here that says note, because I've made this and I don't have anything to add about this. The other thing that you might see, and so here's another example, again a bit inception, and you don't have to do this, but I find it's helpful to make sure that people don't think that you've stolen something, is if I'm taking images that are stock photos, so photos that are free to use if you have certain programs. So for example, Microsoft 365, you have a whole bunch of images that you are permitted to use freely from that document. And so I like to still acknowledge that I've borrowed it from there. So I put from M365 stock images. If you go back to that picture of the eye a few slides ago, you'll notice that came from Adobe stock photos. And if you ever wanted to add an image, that stock photo from Microsoft Word, if you go to Insert and then go to Pictures, you have stock images included with Microsoft Word. It will take a minute to load and then you have to search it up. And these are free to use, safe to use, because you don't want to get accidentally in trouble for taking somebody else's work. Now, as noted, APA has a very specific rules for the use of tables. So most of what we might consider tables, we would actually put as figures, because in order to be a table in APA, for starters, we only have horizontal lines. You'll notice that in this image here of an example table, there's only horizontal lines. There's no up and down vertical lines. It also is very specific about how things are structured, and quite often this doesn't really work well for what we are doing with tables and data. But it is generally organized the same way. Instead of a figure, we have a table number, we have a title of the table, but then the way it's formatted is very strict. So most things that people might consider a table would actually be categorized as a figure in APA. Now, this is usually not a concern for your own assignments, but I do bring this in because lots of people see it in research papers or articles that they're reading when they are doing work for an assignment. and that is where we see multiple citations within one parentheses together. And so we see this when there is a lot of research that backs up some sort of claim or information we're sharing. And we do that by just listing them off, and we don't include pages or paragraph numbers because if this is showing the results of research, we don't need to include the location because that whole document will be focused on the end results of our research. So here, if I'm saying multiple research studies have demonstrated that intelligence quotient is predictive of voting preferences and political involvement, here I can start to list some of those studies. And there's a lot more than these, by the way, for that particular piece of information, but I wanted to provide an example. So Deary et al., 2008, then I'm going to use a semicolon and then list the next source, then a semicolon, and then the next source, semicolon, next source, and then all of these sources. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sources. All of these will be listed separately within the references. And you don't need to put it in any specific order. I often list them in my own work based on the order that I found them. So if you are permitted by your instructor to use quotations in your writing, so again, some rules I want to reiterate. A quotation should never be a sentence by itself. They should always be introduced with your own words. You do need to make sure you use quotation marks around any information you've borrowed word for word. If you don't do that, then it is plagiarism. You want to avoid long quotations because in most assignments, it's going to be too much of what should be your writing. And so it's taking away from the part that we as instructors can mark because we cannot mark the words of other people. We can only mark your words. And so if you have a big quotation stuck in there, it's really reducing the amount of things we can base our marks on. Before you quote, you need to put in a colon or a comma. And if you use a quote of 40 words or more, you need to use a special form of quotation called a block quotation. And my hope is that nobody will be doing this because you should be paraphrasing and you want to keep any quotes you do use in courses that do allow them minimal. Because again, this takes up too much of your own writing. So, when do you need to cite? Whenever you directly quote from a source. When you borrow ideas or informations from another source that you talk about in your writing through paraphrasing or summarization. So you still need to cite, even though it's not word for word, you're still borrowing that information. Whenever you take images or data that comes from another creator or source, as well as whenever information or ideas you share are not considered common knowledge. So common knowledge means things like undisputed historical facts. So Canada became a confederacy in 1867. Widely known and accepted scientific fact, so that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. General cultural or geographical knowledge, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Or information that's accepted within a specific field. If something is not information that somebody on the street would be able to answer if you asked them about it, then it's not common knowledge and you need to include a source to back up the statement you are making. Otherwise, it comes across as an uneducated opinion. Now, in this class, we cover most of the sources you're likely to encounter, but if you're not sure you come across a different source, there's a few things you can do. One, you can use the APA Style and Grammar Guide. They provide all the specific information on what should and shouldn't be part of a citation and reference for different types of sources. Or you can email your instructor. And I would recommend that if you're providing a source to your instructor and asking how you cite or reference it, that you try to do it on your own first and you provide that information in the email. Something like, I am trying to create a reference for this source. Can you check it over for me and provide feedback? I would say the majority of instructors are happy to help you in that way. Again, and I love this thing I found on Twitter back when it was Twitter, now it's X, is part of academic writing is, again, justifying things that might be common knowledge or not. So, something that academics often complain about is we just can't say something is soft. And so in this case, bread is soft. You have to say, according to Baker in 2001, that the bread is soft. And then sometimes you want to make sure it's newer information. Now, this is a little bit of what we would call exaggeration, because knowing that bread is soft, I think in most places is common knowledge, so we wouldn't need to cite and reference it. However, it does bring into that effect. You need to consider if what you're writing is considered common knowledge. If it is not, you need to provide a source to back you up. So, big summary, because this is a big module. Paraphrasing, better than quoting. Paraphrasing keeps your voice of your writing consistent, and it demonstrates to your instructor that you understand the information enough to put it in your own words. If there is a location available, a page, a paragraph, a timestamp, it is required to be part of your citation. It's your location. The only time you don't have that is if you are summarizing an entire source, or in cases for things like AI. You can cite and reference materials from your classes. We went through examples of that. You only include references in your reference list where you have citations linked to them. Don't include sources in your reference list that were just used for inspiration or ideas. Make sure that the title of your sources are in sentence case in your references. So that is where we only capitalize the first word of a title or subtitle, as well as any proper nouns. There are sample essays available that can help guide you in looking at how to use these. And that might be more helpful for you when you are in Module 8. And there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of videos on YouTube, as well as hundreds of other sources online dedicated to supporting students with APA in their formatting, citation, and referencing. But you need to take the initiative to find those. So for this module, complete the notes for this class. There is Chapter 9 of Horkoff. There is a video from Smart Student specifically about APA formatting. And because the way you develop these skills is through practice, there are 5 activities on APA formatting, citation, and referencing that you should do before you go on to Quiz 4, which will assess your understanding and ability to use APA.